This is Lewis up for Boxing Social in association with Empire Fight Store. Delighted to be joined over Zoom with Andy Clark on a lovely Monday morning after this weekend's great night of boxing. Other than that, how's things, mate? How are you?
Good, yeah, really well actually. Just enjoying a bit of time off the last few weeks, not quite as busy as we have been the last few months. So making the most of it, really, making the most of it.
Yeah, definitely. We were talking a little bit about that off camera. That yeah, it seems the sum of the boxing does always slow down a little bit. But I suppose firstly we'll touch on last this Saturday's card. Brad Paul's becoming a British champion, stopping Nathan Heaney in a great night for Cornish boxing, you could say, with getting their first champion in God knows however many years, and caps off a real solid night in general, which I'm sure you echo that as well.
Absolutely, absolutely. I watched it and thoroughly enjoyed it. And to have two British title fights top of a show, of a really strong show, I just think is a really good thing because they are always worthy headliners. A British title fight is a worthy headliner. Of course, you want shows where you've got world titles or you've got a number of world titles or a unification or a fight for undisputed, even better. But a good fight for a British title uh, with fighters who can sell tickets, so you've got a good atmosphere. That is a solid fight night. And that's exactly what we got on Saturday. I enjoyed all of it. I thought all the fights were great. You look at Echo Esselman's incredible late comeback. That was amazing. That was amazing. It was good to see Chantal Cameron back. That was a good fight for her. Good opponent. Good 20 minutes. Good 10-2s for her. And it was a terrific performance from Andrew Kane as well. I thought he looked great. And then the main event delivered in a way that you were always pretty confident that it would, but you never really know for sure. And congratulations to Brad Pauls because I remember commentating on a couple of his fights, one against Ryan Kelly, which was an eliminator for the British title.
Yeah, I remember that fight.
His gym mate Linus Adofia
Yeah,
boxed Denzel Bentley for the British
yeah,
title on
that
the
at the
same
Indigo.
night.
Yeah,
Yeah, they were two really good fights, weren't they? And
hmm
that was a really close fight against Ryan
yeah.
Kelly. He got the decision. He got an English title fight against Tyler Denny. And he'll have had plenty of regrets about that because he didn't do what he normally does. Then he's,
hmm
gone on and we know what he's gone on to do since. So that wasn't your typical kind of, he's not English title level, Tyler Denny, clearly. So that was a
Yeah,
tough one. But he just didn't really do what he normally does in that fight, which is be positive, be aggressive, but not too reckless. But look to get on the front foot, take your space, get into range and let his hands go. And he was a bit hesitant that night. And I think he'll have walked away from it thinking the lesson to be learned there is I can't ever do that again. I
yeah,
can't be second guessing myself and hesitating and as a result just neglecting what it is that I'm good at because I'm maybe a bit too worried about what he's going to do. And to win by late stoppage like that, late stoppages I'm always impressed by because
yeah,
you've got the power to take someone out late and you've got that will deep in the fight to still go for that, to still pursue that when you're maybe at your most tired, even if you get a bit of a second wind, and therefore making that commitment to knock the other person out. He's going to leave you open yourself, but he took it
yeah,
out of the judge's hands, and it's just a really good fight because it did kind of turn, didn't it, in the fourth. Heaney won the
hmm
first three. I thought
yeah.
Pauls was probably winning that fourth round, and then he knocked him down. And at that
hmm
point, I thought he might be able to just take over now and stop him around kind of like 8 or 9 because I did fancy him to
hmm
win.
Yeah.
But then Heaney dug in and got back into it, and I gave him a couple of rounds, like 7 and 9, I think I gave him, and through 10, I had it 5 each. So Paul's by a point, so anyone's. But he just grabbed it. He grabbed it by the throat in those last 2 rounds.
Yeah, definitely. I was saying, I think I tweeted midway through the fight. I was like, they've really picked up of round 13. Like it was really the fight. The second fight was almost going very similar to the first fight. You say Heaney having success early on, then Paul was coming on stronger. So yeah, it's definitely a fight of two halves, I guess you say.
Yeah, and you kind of expected it that it would be like that. I like those kinds of fights where you've got somebody who knows they're probably going to need to be ahead at halfway, and then if they're not, it's going to be difficult. And if they are, then when is that tipping point going to come? And that tipping point, as I said, it came in the fourth, but it was a little bit of a mirage to an extent because it wasn't all downhill from Heaney from then on. It was really
Yeah.
difficult for him, and he was having to put in a massive
hmm
effort claw back those couple of rounds, but it just looked like he might be able to hold it together. And Pauls was tired as well. You know, he was really feeling it too. So with a couple of rounds to go, like I say, I had it level, so Brad Pauls by a point because of the knockdown. But I wasn't sure at that point that he was definitely going to win, because strange things can happen towards the end of fights, because the finish line is in sight. No matter how knackered somebody is, they could sometimes just drag something out of themselves that they didn't even really think was there or possible. But you know, he just didn't let him off the hook at all, did he? He hurt him badly towards the end of the 11th round, and then in the 12th round, he just emptied the tank. Which at that stage of the fight, you'd think, well, of course he's going to do that, but it's not without risks, because you know, you could, if you don't manage to stop him, then you could fall apart yourself.
Yeah, definitely. And as we said earlier, you know, it caps off a real good domestic card, and we get another solid domestic card next week as well for the Joyce Chisora undercard, where we look at fights such as Ryan Garner and Archie Sharp, Dennis McCann, at Baluta 2, Itama Wack. To see that Queensbury, I guess, and you know, and even the domestic promoters in general are putting on solid cards. Although we do see, you know, what's happening in LA, you know, Saudi, etc. It's good that the UK fans as well are getting treated. That we're getting solid domestic matchups in the UK as well. As I say, in the UK.
Yeah, it is. It's absolutely crucial, because I think something that people might have worried about with the Saudi operation is that, well, are we going to have any good fights over here? And I mean, firstly, we're getting Wembley in September, which is
of course,
an absolutely mega card. But below that, there's loads of good boxing below the kind of level that Saudis are really interested in. Loads.
Yeah.
And we know who everybody is, but if you're trying to pull in that kind of wider audience that we always are, you're not going to get loads of them week in, week out. But if you're going to get some of them, they just have to be entertaining fights with a meaningful title on the line. Because for a more casual boxing fan, outside of some really big names, they don't probably really know who anyone is.
Yeah.
So if they tune in, it needs to be a good fight. It's as basic as that. And if it's for the British title, they'll think the British title, okay, that means something. You know, I've seen that belt before, the Lonsdale belt. You know, they wouldn't know who Nathan Heaney or Brad Pauls are, in the same way that they're probably not going to know who Dennis McCann or Jan Baluta are. But if they switch it on and it's a good action, then you'll watch it. You know, I do that channel surfing with sport myself. I'm not deeply into all sports, but I'll flick on a game of rugby union and give it a few minutes. And if it's good to watch, I'll keep watching it. It's that basic principle with sport. You know, if you put it on and it's entertaining, you'll leave it on. And those fights last week were really entertaining. And the chances are they will be this week as well, because with someone like Itama, if you kind of pick him up from the start, he's just kind of different, because in British boxing, we really believe that he could be a massive star, a future heavyweight champion. And that's how you sell him. You know, you put him under that kind of pressure, but that's you want people to start to hear about him beyond boxing, thinking, well, it's this new guy, you know, we all know Tyson Fury and Anthony Joshua, but I was reading in the paper about, or I saw this thing online about, or I saw this clip of this next guy. You know, that's what you want to be doing with him. And those other fights, as you say, Garner against Archie Sharp, I think that's a terrific fight. And McCann against Baluta being a rematch, and with so much going on in and around that division, you know, it's just a good card. It's a good solid card. Top of the bill, Joyce against Chisora.
How do you look at that fight? Yeah.
I mean, it kind of makes you wince a bit, because you look at Chisora, and should he really still be fighting? Well, it's his decision, isn't it? Ultimately, would I prefer it if he'd hung them up? Yeah, because I think he's given enough. And as I understand it, he has made some good money. So I don't think it's really about that anymore for him. But it's his decision. And you're a long time retired. And if this is what he wants to do, then this is what he wants to do. And if he passes his medicals, then he's at liberty to do it. And who is anybody really to tell him that he can't? But having said that, I do anyway, fear for him a bit against Joyce, but Joyce is not
Yeah.
without his own problems because,
Yeah.
he got zhanged twice, didn't he, that year?
Mhm.
And they were bad defeats and they were hard ones to rebound from. And the damage that they did could be permanent for all we know. He wasn't super convincing against Cash Ali, but that's okay because he was off the back of some trauma, basically.
Yeah.
He needs to be able to take care of Chisora, Joyce, if he's going to have a future at the top end of the heavyweight division, and he needs to be able to do it pretty convincingly.
Yeah.
But we don't know for sure whether that's what will happen. I don't think it's an absolute given that Joyce will win that fight and just give Chisora a horrible beating, which is what
Yeah.
people seem to think is going to happen. And I'd have said that would be what would happen as well if those two had collided pre-Zhang, but post-Zhang, you don't know. You really can't be absolutely certain about that.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that because I think if you ask anybody about that fight, a lot of people will say it depends on whoever's got what they've got left. Because with Joyce, obviously the Zhang defeats were tough, but then when someone has a tough defeat like that, you also take into account of all the training and all the amateur experience, especially for Joyce, of how much sort of miles he's got on the clock. So is it sort of, as you say, is it a concern where when you compare a fight like that, the main selling point is whoever's got really the most left?
Yeah, I think that's a pretty fair way to look at it, really, because one thing that people do tend to overlook is the amateurs, because he had a long amateur career and he probably had at least 20 in WSB, Joyce. He had a really good record in WSB, which is, for people who might not know, is 5 3-minute rounds, smaller gloves. And the level you're boxing at, those are professional fights, basically. Standard wise, they're good level professional fights too. So he's got plenty of them on his record. So he did turn professional with a decent number of miles on the clock. In his pro career, he moved quick, and his MO was to juggernaut people, and he wasn't too worried, maybe not as worried as he should be at times, about what was coming back. It wasn't always that way. He boxed smart against Daniel Dubois, but there were other nights I remember seeing him box Carlos Takam where he really did just walk through whatever Takam threw at him. He wasn't mindful of being hit at all. And you did wonder, is this going to catch up with him at some point? Or is he just always going to be able to do this? And then against Zhang, it wasn't possible. And the first time the eye came up, and you can look at that and think, if you're him, you can look at it and think, well, if I hadn't swollen up, then I hadn't gone down. I was going to make it into the second half, and who knows what might have happened. But then in the second fight, he got, how he got up from that right hook in the second fight, I'll never really know. But that was one of the more brutal ones I've seen, because the sheer size of the two guys involved. When you see someone crumpled like that, it's pretty breathtaking. But when you add all of that up, that is a lot of miles on the clock. So it is kind of a case of who's got the most left. The emphasis on it really, though, is, can Joyce beat Chisora and do it convincingly enough that we feel like he's still got a future towards the top end of the heavyweight division, or if he can still be a contender? That's really what we're here to find out. Because if Chisora beats Joyce, he'll get credit for it, but I think people will tinge it with, okay, well, Joyce must be done then, which will be unfair on Derek in a lot of ways. But I don't think anybody looks at Chisora and feels like he's any longer a real force at heavyweight. So unfortunately for him, were he to win, were he to pull it off, that's pretty much what people would say about it, I think.
So would you say, is it almost like, let's just say, if you look at it on Joe Joyce's point of view, is it almost like a lose-lose, would you say? Because at the end of the day, at this point in his career, like, in the most respectful way, does a win over Chisora, I suppose it's in the fashion you do it, I guess, does it hold much weight?
It is, but I know what you mean, because if you're Team Joyce, what you might be thinking to yourself, obviously you would never say it to your fighter, but what you might be thinking to yourself is, how much damage has those fights against Zhang done? The comeback fight against Cash Ali, okay, difficult circumstances off the back of 2 defeats, and he got the win, but it wasn't super convincing. Do we just need to try and get him a kind of real make or break big fight
Yeah.
straight away in case, in trying to rebuild, someone else beats him and then we're done.
Yeah.
That's the worry, isn't it? And in that regard, Chisora is a good choice because people know who he is. And I mean, these two will be getting well paid for this. They're not going to come cheap, the pair of them, are they? So this is pretty expensive domestic card, actually. You'd have thought for Queensberry, but yeah, he's in a difficult. He is in a difficult spot, Joyce, because like you say, I don't know if he'll get much credit or as much as he should get, or it's difficult to work out how much he should get actually if he does do a number on Chisora and look convincing. You know, it's a heavyweight fight. People like the heavyweights. People know who these two are. So even though it clashes with the first weekend of the Olympics, which is probably going to be a bit difficult in terms of the viewing figures, you kind of hope that this would do well, really, because there's no football up against it, is there?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. Well, I did want to stick on the topic of heavyweights. There's obviously a big heavyweight card on the 21st September. I don't think I've caught up with you since there's been the announcement. No, it was obviously it was probably like the worst kept secret in boxing that AJ would be fighting Dubois. But it is all announced on 21st September. Yeah, a lot of people have their views on the fight, but a couple of views on the fight is, and a lot gets made of AJ's chin. And I was listening to Talk Boxing actually a few weeks ago, and they were talking about AJ almost having PTSD from the Ruiz fights. I suppose when you look at a fight like this with Dubois, who has a heavy right hand, who is a heavy hitter, and AJ, who you could say maybe since the Ruiz fight hasn't really, maybe the Usyk fight hasn't really been sort of at the chin check. Do you think that night of New York and when it holds weight from the rest of his career, that there is still sort of some lingering fears there with AJ?
I mean, yeah, it's possible because I mean, I looked into this like a lot for the book, and
of course,
basically, if you get caught in the right place, you're going to go down at heavyweight. And whether you get knocked out cold or whether you go down and you never really recover from it, you know, there's degrees of it. But basically, if you get clipped and it's one that you're not really braced for, that you're not really expecting, whether that's because it's the hands are a bit quicker than you think, or it catches you in a place like that one where you're not really expecting it. It doesn't have to be the one that you don't see, although the one that you don't see has got a really good chance of just switching you off. If you see it, but you're not quite, the brace mechanisms aren't there to soak it up because, you know, they've varied up the power and weight of punch cleverly, or the angle's slightly different, then you're going to go down, and that's just how that is, particularly at heavyweight, and you need to accept that. You have to accept it to a degree. It is a kind of Russian roulette sort of situation. It's you or them, and it could be you. And if you have a situation where it is you, which is what happened to him at Madison Square Garden, and it's the first time that it's you, and everything was looking so good, and then all of a sudden it's gone wrong, and you're fighting through a fog because you're concussed. That's the reality. And you don't manage to find a way back, which very, very few people do, because once you get hit like that, you stay hit. You know, it's not, you can't shake that off. You can kind of cope with it, or maybe get used to it almost, but it's not a case that 2 or 3 rounds later, all of a sudden you'll go from being concussed to not being concussed. You stay that way.
Yeah.
It's just that their instinct and their muscle memory and their sheer resilience somehow allows them to keep fighting, even when sometimes they can't even remember it. So it is a trauma. I mean, it's, you know, you just think about how I've described it there. It's like, it is a trauma, and no one is really expected to do something like that unless you're a soldier or you're in the emergency services or something like that. So it does take some getting past. And it did take him a while. And it's not because he's got an inherently weak chin. I don't really believe in that.
I was going to say, like, those claims. What do you make of that?
I don't.
That's always a claim with AJ.
I just don't really believe it about any fighter. If you get hit on the chin, if you allow yourself to be hit on the chin, if your defense can be a bit faulty, then that's a problem, because if you let it happen too many times, you will get knocked out or you will get knocked down. But that wasn't really what happened against Ruiz. He got caught by quite a strange shot, really. He didn't really make too much of a mistake, but he paid the ultimate price for it. And that can happen. But you just have to kind of, from all the people I've spoken to, you just have to kind of accept that that can happen. And if you can accept that, it can be quite liberating. But if you don't accept it and you feel like you can somehow make sure you never get hit on the chin, and when we say chin, we mean temple, we mean jaw, we mean
Yeah.
a sweet spot is what we mean, isn't it? If you try and fool yourself that you can get through the rest of your career with that never happening again, what will happen is you'll be hesitant and you'll be indecisive and you will be nervous and kind of fearful and tentative. All of the things that people at times have said about him. But as soon as you accept the fact that, to an extent, we go in there, we roll the dice, and whatever happens, and you're prepared to commit, then you're in a much, much better place. Because you give yourself that split second longer on the punch, stay on the punch, set your feet. You give yourself a much better chance of doing the damage to them that you need to do. It gives them a split second longer to react and do it to you, but you've just got to get over that.
Yeah.
Is he over it? Well, the signs are good because, he really committed against Wallin, but you would say Wallin isn't necessarily a massive banger.
Yeah.
And then he cleaned out Francis Ngannou. But of course, after that, people will then say, well, he's a one-fight novice. To an extent, he couldn't really win in that one. But Team Dubois will be telling themselves, no, he's not over it. He's not really been hit hard since. It's still there. It will still be there. You get on top of him and you give it to him, and it will still be there. And that's exactly what I'd be telling Daniel Dubois if I was in his corner as well. And that's the game they're in. And Dubois is different now. He's got that belief now that he didn't seem to have. He's found it these last couple of fights. But he can't be taking right hands off Joshua the way he did against Hrgović.
Yeah.
But different fights bring different game plans. So, you can't assume that what he did against Hrgović is what he'll do against Anthony.
I was about to say that. Like, do you think that there's a lot that people take from the Hrgović fight that, although he did stop him in the end and he came on stronger as the fight went on, the way that Dubois was getting hit would be a key point that people would lean in AJ's favour, especially with the punch power that AJ has as well.
Yeah, I mean, if he gets hit with right hands that frequently from Joshua, then I don't expect him to stay upright. It would be very difficult to stay on your feet, I think. But there's another way of looking at, which is, maybe they felt that was the way to do it against Hrgović, that you could break him, that he was a bully, and that if you stood up to him, you get on top of him, and that is what happened. And you could say that, that would give Dubois a lot of confidence that he chose to fight that kind of fight, a hard fight, a battle of wills fight, a who wants it more fight, not something you would necessarily have associated with him previously. And he came up trumps and he did the business. You could say that that's another big tick in the margin for him, and that he's not going to do that against Joshua because he's not an idiot.
Yeah.
There's different ways of looking at loads of different things. I think Don Charles is totally the right guy for him, because you look how sort of important his dad is to him at ringside. He's a licensed second now, so he can stand as close as he wants. That was the situation out in Saudi. It's a bit unusual, and people sometimes will think, well, God, I don't know about that. He's kind of, he's taking the heat away from the trainer, and does that really work? But it does. For him, it works, doesn't it? And I think having Don, who's probably about the same age as his dad, I would guess. Again, it's that kind of father type figure who can give you that G up, tell you off when he needs to, but in that kind of fatherly way, if you like. I think that's why a lot of the reason why that works. Don's been around a long time, and I think what he's really good at is just figuring out who somebody is and how to get to them and talk to them and communicate with them effectively. And I feel like Dubois is probably that he's that guy who responds to someone who he looks at and feels like he respects their, I don't know what the right word for it is. Age seems a bit basic, but they're kind of their experience,
their wisdom, I guess, or something like that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I think that is it. I think that partnership. I think that's one of the reasons why it works.
Definitely, yeah. And when you look at that card overall as well, arguably, and topped on with a Liam Gallagher performance. If that's what you're into, it's going to be a great night on the in Wembley as well. Is there any one of them? I suppose is it 6 fights on the undercard that takes your pick?
It's a great card. I mean, it really is. People talk about stacked cards, and every card's stacked, isn't it?
Yeah,
Of course, what
yeah,
else can you say?
yeah.
But it really is a terrific card. I mean,
Mhm,
having covered a few of his fights, I was really pleased to see Tyler Denny get a shot
mhm.
against Hamza Shiraz. That's a very difficult fight for him. I don't think it's one that he can't win, but it's a very difficult fight. And um, but you look at the story behind him; it's going to be brilliant to see him walking out at Wembley. Warrington Kachache, I'm keen on that. I like that fight. I think that's a really interesting one. It's just from top to bottom though. It is genuinely just a really good card. I'm looking forward to all of them. You look at Hutchinson boxing Boatsi, and who would ever have thought that fight would be
Yeah,
on a card like that or happening at all? You go
yeah.
back. I was going to
This
say
time
a
6 months ago.
yeah,
Yeah, this
six
even
months
six
ago.
months ago.
Yeah,
Yeah, 6 months ago.
yeah,
You could
as
say
recently as
like,
that. As recently
yeah,
as that.
it's
And
crazy, isn't it?
yeah, I'm missing people out, but it really
Mm.
is a good. It really is a good solid card.
Definitely. You mentioned earlier about the Olympics starting this weekend, and that's obviously a new GB cycle. We're in the 2024 Paris Olympics. Just trying to name all them off the top of my head. We've got Pat Brown, Lewis Richardson, Delicious Ori, Charlie Davison, Chantel Reed, and Rosie Eccles, I believe, and obviously Cindy as well. Obviously part of the GB setup, but she's boxing. But this is for the refugees. But yeah, an exciting time, I guess, for another Olympic cycle to come back round.
Yeah, it is. I mean, it's a different one this time for GB because if you think about, the team we had in, I mean, the last few really, they got 3 medals in Beijing. They got what, 5 in London. They got 3 in Rio. They got 6 in Tokyo, and they had some really
Yeah,
experienced teams. Rounded off by Tokyo, get 6 medals in Olympic
yeah,
Games is an amazing haul, to be honest. But when you looked at that team, it wasn't a big surprise because they had a lot of medals between them. Some of them, it was their second Olympics. They had an absolute ton of experience, and I wasn't I wasn't that shocked that they did what they did. This is different. It's a short cycle for a start. It's 3 years. I remember right off the back of the last Olympics going to the World Championships, which was in Serbia a few weeks after the Olympics, which never normally
yeah,
happens, obviously, because
yeah,
they're not in the same year normally.
yeah.
And it was a brand new team and they struggled. It was hard
Hmm.
work.
Hmm.
Um,
Yeah,
but then they've really kicked on, and 2022 was a successful year. The Commonwealth Games, European Championships, and they've got 6 fighters through out of a possible 13, which I think is a decent effort. I think it's
yeah,
a decent showing. They would have hoped to have got more, but there's possibilities there. You need a good draw in the Olympics.
yeah,
That's something you need. And if they can get that, then some of them are on a good run of form. Charlie Davison's in a second Olympics, for
yeah.
example, so she's got that experience to call on. I chatted to Lewis Richardson the other week down at Sky, who came in for the podcast. He's had a hell of a journey the last few
Oh,
years. So pleased for him that he managed to qualify because
hmm
he was at 75 kilos and then they cut that weight, and then had to somehow make it down to 71 and still be strong enough to fight at 71. And a guy who I've always thought was absolutely supersonic, a Ukrainian called Yuri Zakarev, who I saw win the World Youth
yeah,
Championships and then the World Senior Championships in the same year. He hasn't made it. He hasn't qualified, for example. So
hmm
he's someone who isn't going to be there. Delicious Ori has got Jalolov. That's the problem. If you're in his half of the draw, then you've got a big problem. Pat Brown is the kind of guy who I look at, and I'm always interested by someone who kind of comes up on the rail because he won the senior
yeah,
elites a couple of years in a row,
hmm
and you could see that he was a really well organized, well drilled fighter. But you also kind of felt like Lewis Williams was nailed on to go
hmm
at heavyweight because he did pretty well in that first World Championships.
hmm
Actually, he got to the quarterfinals, I think, and then he got a gold at the Commonwealths, and he did well at the Europeans, and he went to the first qualifier, but he didn't qualify, and then Pat got his chance and he took it.
yeah,
And when I see someone do that, I think to myself, they haven't got that kind of, I won't describe it as baggage necessarily, but they maybe didn't think this was going to happen. And then
yeah,
all of a sudden it's happening. And although, of course, he's had time to think about it, it may not have been something that he was obsessing about
Mhm.
or something that he thought was going to happen. It's not like he was number one like Lewis and thinking, I've got to keep my place, got to keep my place, got to keep my place. He goes to the first qualifier, don't make it, and then that's it. He just kind of, as I say, just came up on the rail and then gets his chance, takes it, boom, and there he is. So I just wonder whether he might. Yeah, again, you need a good draw. You always need a good
Because
draw.
I suppose they in with Pat they've got I think De La Cruz obviously won 2016 and 2021 gold. So that'll obviously be
He's not
92
the
kilo.
youngest. He's not the youngest Julio La Cruz, though, is he? I mean, you talk about miles on
Oh
the
no, of
clock.
course.
Those lads who are still doing it for the Cubans of that team they seem to have had forever, which has gradually disintegrated over the last few years. Him and Arlen Lopez are both still going at 80 and 92.
Yeah.
It's amazing, really. And La Cruz is, he's still an absolute wizard. I saw him in Thailand this time last year,
Yeah.
boxing in this absolutely ludicrous heat, and it was still as much of a joy to watch him as always. But a third Olympic gold medal, that is. I mean, I kind of do. I mean, I'd love it if he did it, but I'd love it if Pat Brown beat him.
Of course.
That'd be mega.
Definitely, yeah. Well, the meeting is almost running out, so I've just got a last one from myself. On the topic of Olympics, especially this year, it's sparked conversation as we see fighters such as Hassan Boy Dusmatov, Beatrice Herrera, obviously Bakadir Jalilov being the main ones, having a professional career, but also having an amateur career as well. Sort of, do you think that it's fair, I guess, to have a professional career and also have an amateur one as well? When you look at guys like Pat Brown, for example, who hasn't.
No, I don't mind it. I've got no problem with it. I remember I went to the final qualify for Rio when they admitted professionals for the first time, and everybody was talking about how unfair it was, and it was quite patronizing, really. They talk about amateurs like they were these callow kind of, young weaklings who would just get beaten up by these ogreous professionals. 14 professionals went to that qualifier. 3 qualified for the Olympic Games. None of them got medals. And one was a former world champion in Hassan N'Dam. It's completely different. There's only one fighter who has managed to win an Olympic gold medal as an active professional, and that was Albert Batagaziev, who was 3-0 when he won in Tokyo. So it's a very, very difficult thing to do to keep them going at the same time. Jalilov has done it, but his pro career has been hampered by it. And when he went back into the amateur fold to keep going with his amateur career, basically he went to the Asian Championships in 2019, and he needed to go deep in that to qualify for the World Championships and then to keep going. Israel Madrimov did the same thing. He went back into the same Asian Championships, got knocked out in the quarterfinals, and that was it. It was over. So not anyone can do it. And look at Madrimov now. He's fighting Terence Crawford in a couple of weeks. So it's a really hard thing to do because those 3-minute rounds, it is a completely different format.
Yeah.
And one of the reasons why established professionals, people talk about Golovkin going back in and all of that, the reason why they haven't done it is because they know how hard it would be and that they would be putting their reputation on the line, and it would just be, it's a no-win. It's a no-win situation for them. So people need to kind of just understand that elite level international amateur boxing is a very, very high standard. And that 2021 World Championships I spoke to you about, Gyasov came back to that. Shakarama Gyasov got his head jabbed off in the first round, got beat. Dazmatov was in that as well, got beat in the first round because they'd been away from it for a while. But they were under no illusions. They knew how tough it would be. But really long answer to a simple question. No, I don't. I don't have a problem with it.
Yeah, definitely. That's completely fair enough. Andy, as always, a pleasure speaking to you on various different topics of boxing. And as always, mate, a real pleasure to chat to you. And I'm sure we'll be catching up soon, mate. Appreciate it, mate.
All right, cheers. We'll do.
Top man. Thank you, mate.